Hi, everyone. Sorry, I wasn't quite sure if we were going to get notified that everybody is here, but I think that we're all together now. So welcome. My name is Andrea Ruppar. I am Associate Professor of Special Education at University of Wisconsin-Madison and one of the co-editors of Inclusive Practices.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. And I'm Jennifer Kurth, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Kansas and also one of the co-editors. And in the effort of being inclusive, we wanted to share a little bit about ourselves. So my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a white woman with curly red hair in my office. And Andrea, if you want to.
Yes, and my pronouns are also she, her, hers, and I am a white 40-something woman with red hair, but it's straight and then it's in a ponytail today. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. We'd like to introduce you to the journal Inclusive Practices. We are a research to practice journal focused on disseminating information about best and research-based practices for including individuals with complex disabilities in schools and communities and workplaces. So just by way of introduction, we published our first issue in February 2022. So we are a very new journal, and Jenny and I are the inaugural co-editors of the journal. Inclusive Practices is published by SAGE in coordination with TASH, and we are a practitioner-oriented journal, so we publish research overviews with practical recommendations, which are feature articles, and we also have two other article formats that allow us to disseminate new and emerging practices and share information across the field.
So when we approached SAGE and approached TASH and about having this journal, Inclusive Practices, one of the things that we were really interested in, and we had heard from our colleagues in the field, is that we need to have a better mechanism for sharing practical research-based strategies with people who are doing the actual work in schools and in communities to make sure that the people who are doing the work have some of the best tools and research-based strategies at their fingertips. And so with that in mind, we got together a group of us, not just Andrea and I, but a group of us to propose this journal, Inclusive Practices, thinking that it really does fill a need for practical strategies to support people who are doing the work in schools, in communities, and in workplaces. So we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that Inclusive Practices is a journal that covers a range of topics that are relevant to practitioners. So anything from inclusive therapeutic strategies to inclusive communities, including faith communities. We've had a great article published on that topic, positive behavior support strategies, inclusive workplaces, K-12, and preschool and secondary education, and then also, of course, supporting choice, self-determination, and self-advocacy. Some of those are the things that we think are really important for practitioners to have more information about to guide their work. And so those are some of the things that we think are important to include in our journal.
Sorry. So one of the things to think about if you're thinking about submitting an article or hopefully publishing in Inclusive Practices is to think about the audience of our journal. And as I mentioned before, our primary purpose is to disseminate research-based practices and new emerging practices to people who are involved in the field or involved in supporting individuals who have complex disabilities, and of course, individuals with disabilities themselves. Our purpose is to inform a variety of practitioners and individuals who are involved in supporting inclusive practices in communities across the world. So when you're writing for inclusive practices, we hope that you think about these audience members that kind of span the lifespan of individuals with complex disabilities. So their teachers, their families, their direct support providers, administrators of all kinds, advocates, and of course also people with disabilities themselves. And to think about making the information that you're sharing in these articles, in these manuscripts, really accessible to those audiences.
Great. So Oh, God.
No, it's okay.
All right. So we say that manuscripts rather written for inclusive practices should focus on people with the most complex support needs. So people with significant disabilities, ongoing support needs, and include implications for research and practice that are relevant to people with complex support needs. So although manuscripts might address a broader population that extends beyond only people with significant support needs, there must be a clear and distinguishable implication for people who have the most complex or significant support needs. So inclusive practices emphasizes ecological and educational validity in the content of the journal, rather. So the translation of applied research conducted in natural inclusive settings that's likely to be more relevant to our readers than research that's conducted in highly artificial or controlled or segregated settings. So we're really interested in making sure that the research that we're talking about in inclusive practices is inclusive research that is relevant to practitioners. And the purpose of the journal then is to publish this translated research, not original research. So we do not publish literature reviews. We do not publish database papers. We publish that translation. So people who've taken that next step of saying, this was a really important thing that we learned in doing research. Here's how people can use it. Here's how people with disabilities can use it. Here's how their families can use it. Here's how their teachers can use it. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're considering whether inclusive practices might be a good fit for the paper that you're working on. So it is a quarterly journal that's published by TASH and through the SAGE platform that addresses that research to practice consideration for people with significant support needs across the lifespan, like Andrea said. And we want to make sure that the articles that we publish are relevant so that they're timely, they're reflective of sort of what's happening in the world today, that they're, leading the field in important new directions. We don't want to just kind of publish the same things that have already been published. We see this as a chance to really push the field forward by figuring out ways to keep putting good research into the hands of the people who need it. And so we want to think about tips and strategies for practitioners, families, folks across the lifespan that are going to be relevant from them. Give them current information, give them insights, and let them do their jobs better, because we think people who are doing this work are really committed to doing a great job, and we want our journal to be a way that supports them to do the great work that they're committed to doing.
So I want to touch on something that Jenny mentioned on the previous slide, which is that Inclusive Practices does not publish original research. And so what does this mean? Because we do sometimes get submissions of papers that are reporting primary data. And as a general rule, the papers that we'll be publishing in Inclusive Practices will not include primary empirical data. So if you have a small set of data that you would like to share and disseminate, it might be more appropriate or suitable for a brief report in a research journal rather than in a translational journal like Inclusive Practices. So what we look for is synthesis of research, synthesis of findings, and translating that into something that is practical and useful. If you're interested in submitting an interview, and we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of formats here coming up, but if you're interested in submitting an interview, I think the interview should clearly identify who you are interviewing and provide information for the reader to understand why that perspective is important. So if you have to, a general rule of thumb is if you need to use a pseudonym because of IRB requirements, you might want to think about sharing that information from another point of view, maybe more general recommendations rather than primary data from a research study. And if the people who you are interviewing or including in your research, in your manuscript, are not involved in research, you won't need to mask their identities. So it's not necessary to mask their identities if they're participating in the paper as an author or as an interviewee. And we'll share a couple of examples of those kinds of papers here in a minute.
I muted myself, so I need to unmute real quick. So yeah, as Andrea said, what we wanted to do next was, now that we've sort of laid this foundation of what we're imagining and hoping inclusive practices to be, to talk through the different types of articles. So like Andrea mentioned, there's 3 types of articles we are publishing currently. And the first are feature articles, which are probably the most familiar to a lot of people. And these are generally 18 to 20 page length articles, inclusive of references, tables, and figures, that set forward a set of strategies or tips or steps or something like that, that say, here's a good research-based practice, and here's how you can actually implement it. So those feature articles are going to guide readers through sort of step-by-step how to take this idea from research and use it in their own practice, use it in their own classrooms, use it in their own homes, use it in their own workplaces, those sorts of things. One of the important things about the feature articles is that they go through a full anonymous peer review, meaning that we have, we select, Andrea and I will select peer reviewers that will do a read through of a de-identified paper, so they won't know who the author is and, you know, those sorts of things, and see that it's a good fit for the journal, that it's up to date, that it's relevant, that it promotes inclusive practices, that it's strengths-based, you know, and essentially aligns with the values of TASH, and that it's, like I said, relevant and, you know, useful, I guess, for practitioners. And so following that peer review, then we'll make an editorial decision. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that next. But what we wanted to do too was just say, we've got some great examples of feature articles that we've published. And I think the next slide is one recent one.
Oop, there we go.
So this was an article from Grace Francis, Jared Stanley. And what they did is they said, you know, there's been a lot of research around age of majority and what that looks like for families and people with disabilities navigating that transition from childhood to adulthood. And so what they did is they sort of read through that research, and they came up with 5 considerations for practitioners to say, instead of you practitioners having to read all of these research studies, we'll read them for you and we'll synthesize it with these 5 considerations. And so they talked about providing information about guardianship and alternatives, assessing and teaching decision-making skills, practicing to support decision-making, and designing opportunities for failure and for feedback, and considering the need for emotional support. So again, it's that kind of idea of they took this research-based idea, they did the work of figuring out what it means for practitioners, in this case, families and people with disabilities, and then wrote up some recommendations for people to look through. And that's what we're really looking for in a feature article, is for the author to do that work for the reader so that they can take in their hands something that they could use tomorrow. And to us, I think that's a good indication of what a good feature article would look like in inclusive practices, that there's ready to go strategies that might include templates or checklists or those sorts of things that would be useful, you know, upon reading the article in inclusive practices.
One of the things that I think really makes this an exemplary article, in my view, is that the recommendations are very digestible and clear. There's 5 considerations, and these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that the research has suggested are important for people to consider. So whether you're on an IEP team, or whether you're a family member or somebody else who's supporting an individual who's in this transition age and transitioning to age of majority, you have kind of really key information at your fingertips about, okay, what do I need to be thinking about as I'm going through this process? Now we're going to share a little bit about the other 2 formats. So if that's our kind of feature article, it's our most common format. We also wanted to create a space for people in the field to share information with each other. This is really in the spirit of TASH, in that it's an organization where there's a lot of information sharing among people who are across the country and across the world who are supporting this very specific group of individuals on a daily basis. So we wanted to create some formats for people to share their own personal experiences, their own ideas, their own perspectives, and also a way to share some more breaking news, some more cutting edge information that might not yet have research support, but might be important for other people to know about. So the first format we'll talk about is what we call the perspective page. And this is a forum for self-advocates, for practitioners, for family members to share innovative ideas that they've come up with in their own context that are applicable to the work of inclusive practices kind of overall. Our field is characterized by the need for constant innovation, and each individual needs such unique supports that sometimes we end up with tricky problems that we solve on our own, or we share an experience of, look, this is how I did it, right? This is how I got the job. This is how I took control of my life, or this is how I, as an administrator, reworked a district so that it was more inclusive of kids with more complex disabilities. So that's really the purpose of this kind of an article. These go through a slightly different review process in that an editor, i.e. me or Jenny, will review these submissions first, and then invite one board member to also review the article, at least one more board member. So a little bit of a different review process from the feature article, but still an anonymous review process from the board member. Again, I mentioned this before, but one format for perspective page that's been taken up a couple of times is an interview, and we have a couple of examples of those. And remembering that these are not sharing research findings, that these if you choose to write an interview, it's helpful to write it in a conversational format, and it's okay to share information, share information that would maybe be identifiable and need to be kept confidential in a research study. Of course, that requires the consent of the person that you're interviewing, but really don't want to present it as research findings. From my view, a perspective page needs a really strong why. Why are you sharing this information? What is the context? Who is providing this perspective? We as readers need to be convinced that that perspective is important, that it's valuable, that's generally useful for other people. Think clearly about your intended audience. Who are you sharing this information with, and for what purposes? And again, kind of having a really clear takeaway. What are the main points that you think would be most helpful for other people to know? And so we have a couple of examples here, and I'll share one. This is an example of an interview that was conducted with a self-advocate, Micah Fialka Feldman, and his support provider, Andrea Hayes. And so they are cited as authors on this paper, but the work is a collaborative between Alyssa Lockman-Turner, Sarah Bubesh, and Micah and Andrea to share how Micah is supported through circles of support, and how Micah is able to direct his own services. And it provides a really nice, almost a case for other people to see a model of what this can look like. This is his perspective, this is his experience. And so that's kind of how this perspective page article came to be. Jenny, is there anything else you want to share about this format?
Nope. I think you've done a nice job covering it. Thank you, though.
The other one I'll share with you, because so far we've only had 2 published, and they both happen to be interviews, but they don't need to be interviews. And we certainly didn't conceptualize this as an interview format. But another example here is an interview with Kurt Schneider around systemic transformation of a school district, and how he and Suzanne Sand, who is also on a school board, work together to reorganize their district around inclusive practices.
Great.
Do you want to take this one, Jenny?
Sure. Yeah. So, like Andrea said, the leading edge is a third type, our currently third type of article that we're interested in publishing. And as she said, this is a place to share new, cutting edge information that might not have a ton of research support to back it yet, but it is relevant to sort of things that are happening in the world at the time. So maybe there was a new Supreme Court decision that's going to be applicable to the field, or maybe there's a technological breakthrough that, or, you know, things that like artificial intelligence or something like that, that are new emerging things that are relevant to practitioners that they might want to know more about. So in this case, that's what we're interested in doing, is a sort of a short description of what this new, or not necessarily new, but this topic is that's relevant to the field, that's going to help push us in a new direction, even before maybe there's a ton of research to back it up. So this is also reviewed by one of the editors, me or Andrea, and then one editorial board member. We are looking in this case for sort of research-based essays on a variety of current topics aimed at giving practitioners information about those emerging topics that are relevant to their work. So things like I said, you know, recent legal decisions, policy briefs, global perspectives, technology applications and innovations, other sort of intersectional considerations. And so we think there's a lot of this happening in the world right now that are important for us to share with the field and to help people think about using in their own practices. So as I mentioned, artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. This is changing everything there is to change about literacy, right? And how we access information, share information. There's a lot of potential there. Social media and social networks. That's another thing that is connecting the world in ways that were unthinkable, you know, when I was a kid, and yet they're continuing to evolve in terms of who uses what and how they use it and what it's used for. That could be a great way to think about ways to connect people, to integrate social media or social networks into your workplace, you know, whatever that might be. LGBTQ plus issues is another important thing for us to consider, and the impact of having, you know, multiple identities and in some cases marginalized identities, and how that impacts people with complex support needs. And then other, like I said, recent court cases and legislation. So this is an example of a recently published leading edge article. This was written by Oscar Hughes, and he did an essay talking about the importance of people with complex support needs and intellectual disability having support to express their own gender identities, understand what their own gender identities are, and how we can support people through that process. And so this was a really nice example of how we can integrate some of those important topics into the field and give a venue for practitioners to learn a little bit more about those topics.
A little bit about the review process. We talked about who the reviewers would be for each of the different kinds of manuscripts, but we aim for a 60-day review process. There are 4 different kinds of decisions that we can make as editors: accept with revisions, major revisions, or reject. And usually authors will have about 30 days for revisions. And again, this is what we aim for, but we want it to be, because it's something that we're trying to get things out pretty quickly. We try to move things along as quickly as we possibly can, you know, knowing that we also have our full-time faculty members and humans. But so we talked a little bit also about some of those topics of interest related to the leading edge articles, but just overall, that we are often asked, what kinds of articles are you looking for? What topics are you interested in seeing more about? And so these are some of the things that we are interested in seeing. So teacher and caregiver shortages, you know, the teacher shortage, and there's a special education teacher shortage. There's a shortage of educators who are prepared to teach students with disabilities of all types all across the country. And those are only getting more and more pressing. We also likewise have a shortage of direct support professionals who support individuals with disabilities in their communities and homes. What is happening with these shortages, and what as a field can we think about? How can we draw together research to identify ways to reduce these shortages, encourage more people to enter this field that we love so much? So that's one idea, one topic of interest. Anything around choice and control and autonomy and self-determination are always going to be issues that relate to individuals across the lifespan and especially affect individuals with complex disabilities, especially and those with complex communication needs. We talked a little bit about emerging technologies. So how does AI, how does social networks, how does the latest technology affect our individuals with complex disabilities? How can we leverage those technologies to support more inclusive communities and schools? Thinking about remote supports, of course, with COVID-19, we all started to teach online and work online and support each other online in new ways. How is that? What have we learned from those? What lessons have we learned from that? And what can we use to be able to better support inclusion, independence, autonomy among individuals with complex disabilities? And then finally, also likewise, mental health is an issue that is affecting individuals with complex disabilities, as it's been affecting a lot of other groups since the pandemic. What do caregivers, what do family members, what do teachers need to know about addressing mental health needs for individuals with complex disabilities? How can we think about innovative ways of including students who have struggles with mental health in their school communities, in their home communities? And what strategies are emerging to be able to do that.
And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list.
Right, not an exhaustive list.
And what we're hoping is that you're hearing that we're looking for topics that cover the range of, the lifespan, and then the range of factors that impact people's lives. And if you're not sure, if you have an idea for a paper, you're not sure about it, feel free to email us and we can let you know. We might need to do a little bit back and forth to kind of dig into the topic if needed, and then maybe give some ideas about what might be the best type of article. Would it fit best as a feature, a leading edge, or a perspectives piece? And, thinking about the depth of research that you have to draw upon, those might be factors to consider as well. But we're certainly open to ideas, but we thought of these, 5 things as really pressing things happening in the world right now, and that we would love to see more submissions related to, in addition to all the other important topics that I'm sure you're imagining.
So that is the end of our formal presentation, and I see we have a few questions in the chat. So we can kind of go through those, and if others want to join, add questions. It seems like we have 2 different ways of asking questions, through the chat and also through the Q&A box. So I guess you can write them in either place. And Jenny, are you able to see these as well?
I am, yes.
Okay.
So I see, Joseph, you had a question about examples of recently published or approved for publication articles. So we tried to share some of those today. So that was, thank you for asking for that, because that was something we actually thought of. But if you're a TASH member, you should be able to access the journal as well through the tash.org website. And Donald might need to correct me, but I think if you go to, there's a tab that says resources. I think that's where you can find the journal. And the great thing is that this Inclusive Practice Journal is free for all TASH members. So it's not behind any paywall. Everyone who's a member of TASH is going to be able to access all of these articles. And so that would be a nice place to look around too and see, what has been recently published, and what might be some gaps that you see from the journal that need additional articles published related to. So hopefully that helps.
And all of, well, I guess it's only through the end of this week, but our first issue is fully open access through June 30th. And that first issue contains, we selected examples of each type of article so that there would be a collection of exemplars. JP asks, are you interested in hearing from district administrators reporting on their experiences and successful practices, including students with disabilities in general education, 100 times yes, absolutely. That is exactly what we want to hear from. And that sounds like it would be a great, maybe a perspective page article, or perhaps a leading edge. So if you are interested in writing a paper about that, you can definitely reach out. Accessibility and environmental learning. That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely an unexplored or underexplored area, I should say, at least. And I think that people might be interested in learning about how we can enhance accessibility and environmental learning. Do you want to take the next one, Jenny?
And then to become a reviewer for inclusive practices, one of the easiest ways to do that is to contact us and tell us that you're interested. And there is a just like a little survey that we have people collect so that we can gather information about your areas of expertise and what types of articles you should review. So, you know, if a person's really knowledgeable about, you know, direct support providers in healthcare settings, we need to know that, so that if we get that kind of article, we know to contact you. Whereas if another person's got a lot of expertise and knowledge in access to communication and augmentative and alternative communication systems, we know to connect you with the right article. So that's what we would be looking for, is that we want to know enough about you so we can know what types of articles we should send your way. And then we will enter you into our database in the SAGE platform that helps us identify the best reviewers for a particular submission. And we're hopeful that people want to do that.
Nicole is talking about DSP wages. This sounds like a great topic for a perspective page. And that's exactly the kind of viewpoints that we hope to be able to share, the experiences of people who are, you know, obviously working in these positions and being underpaid. It's certainly a barrier.
And likewise, if you've come up with ideas of how to do that lobbying work and what
Yes.
are the avenues that have been successful, you know, that would be a wonderful thing to share. And I think a lot of people would benefit from that.
Angela asked, I want to center people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in creating a paper, and I'm interested in how visuals are used in articles, that graphic facilitation increases access. Can papers be visual and written? That's a really cool idea. You can definitely have figures. I don't think we have, and as long as something doesn't need licensing, I think that would probably be, and it might not be a barrier even if we need to get permissions for things. But absolutely, I think those kinds of innovative practices are exactly what we are really interested in seeing. And we have had a couple of authors co-author with individuals with intellectual disabilities and an individual without an intellectual disability co-authoring articles. And I think it's a really exciting new pathway that we hope inclusive practices can really lead the way on, because we have to live up to our name.
Right. And we aim to do so, yes. And then, yeah, Nicole, other great ideas around long COVID, autism, intellectual developmental disability, health disparities, lesson learned in the pandemic. Absolutely, those are all great ideas. And I think there's probably an article, you know, or more in each of those. I could imagine a feature, perspective, cutting edge or leading edge, rather. I think there's lots of opportunities there.
And yes, David, oh yeah, were you gonna?
I was, go for it.
All I was going to say is yes, absolutely. You know, TASH is an international organization and we aim to have an international scope. So, and we would just make sure to invite reviewers that reflected that as well.
Yeah.
Other questions? I see, Hazy, you have a question about how we became so awesome, and I don't think I have an answer.
But feel very complimented.
But thank you.
Yeah, so I hope that everyone heard that we're really interested in advancing the field. And I think all of you in just this little short time period have shared some really great ideas of ways we can do that. And I think this is what this venue is for, is to figure out what is the next thing we need to be doing. How do we improve the world, improve our practices, improve our support so that people are going to be living, flourishing, thriving lives, and, thinking about ways that we can do that. So we really welcome your submissions and are happy to work with you to figure out how best to do that. Just send us an email and we'll happy to talk it out.
There is a question here. Are there any common missteps or fatal flaws you see people make in their submissions we can avoid? I would say that's kind of why I emphasize the primary data, is that's usually the main thing that and I'll often write, instead of a desk reject, try to invite the author to revise without sharing empirical data, but we are definitely that's definitely the one thing that we don't do. Can you think of anything else? Fatal flaws or missteps. I think the other main takeaway is that the recommendations need to be pretty clear. Pretty digestible, pretty tangible, a list or, a collection of steps or a collection of things to consider are very helpful and embraceable for people.
Right.
Any upcoming special issues? Well, we sort of have one that is in the works, but we are also inviting special issues as well. So if you are interested in editing a special issue, please let us know. We have a review process for that as well. Yeah,
I think we have one special issue that's kind of in the works, broadly related to avoiding guardianship and self-determination, and another one that's broadly related to transition and post-secondary inclusive education. And we're really excited about both of those. And like Andrea said, we are hopeful that other people can put together a collection, because what we look for in a special issue is to say kind of like a big topic, maybe it's communication support, or maybe it's, transition, or whatever that might be, and find a few other people to write articles that would complement that topic or be related to that topic, that we could publish all together, so that the readers of Inclusive Practices would have one whole, bundle of articles related to this one topic that they could use in their practices. So we're very much interested in those as well.
I'm watching the chat for any other questions. I don't know how long to wait, but
Yeah.
If you do have other questions, of course, you can always email Jenny or I, or both of us, and we're happy to talk to you about your ideas, your manuscript ideas, and we're happy to work with authors. So if you're not sure, please reach out, because we do often work with authors to kind of crystallize ideas and before submission.
And Megan, there's not necessarily going to be a call for special issues, but I think we can, I think right now we have proposals put together for special issues, but if we come up with ideas that we are looking for, we will certainly announce that. And Angela, thank you for the encouragement about thinking about who is a researcher and who we need to support. I think that's exactly what we're thinking about, is that we do want to make sure that science is available to everyone and everyone is viewed as a scientist, and that there's ways for everyone to participate in this process and in moving the field forward. And we want to be inclusive of all of that wisdom as we go forward. So thank you.
Joseph has a couple of questions here. Teacher related articles. I'm assuming you're asking about like teaching strategies. And if so, yes, that definitely would be useful. And then how to review for inclusive practices. Well, getting on our radars is one way. So making sure that you have you're in our system, and then you can be appointed as a reviewer. And in general, what we ask our reviewers to do is to look at the article in terms of the things that we've talked about just now. You know, what are there clear implications? Is it inclusive of individuals with complex disabilities? Does it have clear implications for individuals with complex disabilities and for inclusion? And then also, we also ask the reviewers to look at the research that the people are reporting, and making sure that there are not any gaps or any, unintentional or biases towards one set of findings versus another. So really looking at being comprehensive and clear is what we mostly look for. Teaching teachers to be more inclusive. Yes. Right. That is what we're trying to do with anything that's related to school.
Great.
All right. Well, I think great. Thank you very much for all of your comments and your questions. Please stay in touch, and yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.